My daughter Elena cried on the witness stand, her voice trembling with sincere grief. She told the judge I had become a paranoid stranger who had lost touch with reality. My son Mikhail confirmed her words, his face a mask of filial concern. They were not lying. They were speaking their truth, built on a legend I had maintained for 50 years. I, Alexander Novak, 81 years old, a former history professor, but in reality, a CIA operative. They didn't know that my immigration papers were a masterpiece created in Langley. They didn't know that my paranoia was a professional instinct that doesn't die. I just looked at the flag. In the back row sat Arthur Jenkins, my old handler. The performance was over. It was time for the final act. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The room was beige, a color chosen, I had always believed, for its ability to absorb and neutralize all human emotion. It was a room designed for bureaucratic process, not for the culmination of a human life. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, weak coffee, and the faint underlying anxiety of a dozen petitioners who had sat in this very chair before me. From my position at the respondents' table, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the stage. The raised dais for the judge, the witness stand, the clerk's station. It was a theater of judgment, and I, Alexander Novak, 81 years of age, was the day's featured performer. The thick file on the government lawyer's table, the one that contained my entire, meticulously fabricated life, identified me as a retired professor of Eastern European history, a political refugee granted asylum in 1973. For 5 decades, that legend had been my shield. Today, it was the weapon being used against me. I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands resting one over the other on the smooth, cool surface of the table. My suit was old, but well cared for, my shoes polished, my silver hair neatly combed. My expression, I knew, was one of placid, slightly weary neutrality. Inside, my mind was a quiet, humming engine of analysis, every part of me on a heightened state of alert I hadn't fully engaged in decades. I was not a petitioner. I was a field operative in a compromised position, assessing the threat environment. The judge, a woman named Ramirez, was the primary variable. I studied her. Her face was a mask of professional impartiality, her dark eyes revealing nothing but a deep, procedural weariness. She moved her papers with an efficient, almost robotic precision. She was not a person to be swayed by emotion. She was a functionary of the system, a bureaucrat who believed in the sanctity of the documented record. This was a critical piece of intelligence. The government lawyer, a young, earnest man from the Department of Homeland Security, was not an adversary. He was, in a sense, my own unwitting ally. His job was to review my file and confirm my eligibility for citizenship, a process that was meant to be a simple, final stamp of approval on a long and quiet life. He believed in the legend in front of him. He believed in the quiet, refugee professor who had contributed to American society through a lifetime of quiet scholarship. His presence was a formality, a baseline of the official, accepted truth. The true threat sat to my left, at a table identical to my own. My children, my daughter, Elena, and my son, Mikhail. I could feel the waves of their anxious, sorrowful energy across the few feet of empty space that separated us. I did not need to look at them to know their expressions. I had seen them for weeks. Elena's face would be a mask of tragic resolve, her eyes red-rimmed from tears she believed were righteous. Mikhail's would be a study in grim, reluctant duty, his jaw set, his posture rigid with the discomfort of a son, doing what he believed to be a painful but necessary thing. I allowed myself a brief, sweeping glance in their direction. They sat with their lawyer, a man whose earnest performance of concern was almost as good as their own. They were not my enemies. They were something far more dangerous. They were true believers. They believed in the fiction of my life, and they now believed in the fiction of my decline. Their betrayal was an act of love, and that made it all the more devastating, all the more difficult to counter. My gaze drifted past them, to the American flag that stood on a heavy brass pole beside the judge's bench. Its colors were bright, its stars and stripes a perfect, ordered geometry. It was the symbol of the nation I had served in secret, the nation I was now petitioning to officially call my home. It was the symbol of the promise that had been made to me all those years ago, a lifetime of service in the shadows, in exchange for a final, peaceful life in the light. That promise was now being threatened by the very family the lie had been designed to protect. As my eyes scanned the room, a lifetime of training took over. I took in the exits, the position of the court security officer, the faces of the handful of observers in the public seating area in the back. It was a standard threat assessment, a habit as ingrained as breathing. And then I saw him. He was in the last row, sitting perfectly still, a man of my own generation, dressed in a simple, forgettable gray suit. He looked like any other retiree, perhaps a curious citizen observing the machinations of government. But he was not. I knew the way he sat, his back never touching the chair, leaving a space for operational readiness. I knew the way his eyes were not on the judge or on me, but were constantly, placidly scanning the entire room, monitoring every detail. I knew the profound, practiced stillness of a man who has spent a lifetime waiting and watching. It was Arthur Jenkins, my former handler, the man whose voice over a crackling shortwave radio had been my only link to my true identity for 15 years in the frozen heart of the Cold War. His presence here was not a coincidence. It was a signal. It was a quiet, powerful, and absolutely unambiguous message sent directly to me across the room. Langley is aware. You are not disavowed. We are observing the situation. A profound cold calm settled over me. The emotional variables of the situation, the pain, the betrayal, the sorrow, became secondary. The mission parameters had just become clear. This was no longer a family tragedy. It was a counterintelligence operation, and I was not alone. The judge cleared her throat, shuffled a paper, and called the first witness to the stand. My daughter, Elena. The hearing had begun. Elena was the first to take the stand. She moved with a slow, heavy grace, a woman carrying a burden of grief she believed to be true. She sat in the witness chair, her hands clutching a crumpled tissue, her face a pale and tragic mask. She was not performing. Her sorrow was authentic, her tears genuine, and that was the most brutal part of the entire ordeal. She was not a conspirator in a malicious plot. She was a loving daughter, convinced of her father's descent into madness, and her testimony was an act of desperate, misguided love. The government lawyer began his gentle, sympathetic questioning, and she began to speak, her voice trembling. She spoke of the man I had become since her mother, my dear Anna, had passed. She painted a picture of a man haunted by phantoms, a man retreating from the world into a fortress of paranoia. She described, with a pained expression, my nightly rituals. She told the judge about my endless, obsessive habit of checking the locks on the doors and windows before bed, sometimes 2 or 3 times. As she spoke, the memory of a cold, damp night in a safe house in Prague, decades ago, surfaced in my mind. A compromised lock, a moment of inattention, a colleague who was never seen again. The habit of checking my locks was not a symptom of senility. It was a scar, a deeply ingrained protocol of survival that had kept me alive for half a century. Her first piece of evidence against my mind was, in fact, a testament to its unwavering discipline. She then spoke of my walks. She described, with a voice thick with tears, how she would sometimes drive by my house late at night and see my solitary figure, a shadow moving through the dark, walking the perimeter of my small property. Over and over again, she saw a lost old man, wandering aimlessly in the grip of a restless dementia. She could not know that I was performing a counter-surveillance sweep, a routine as natural and necessary to me as breathing. I was checking for unfamiliar cars, for lights in windows that should be dark, for any deviation from the established baseline of my quiet suburban street. The skills that had protected my cover, and by extension her own childhood, were now being presented as the pathetic ramblings of a broken mind. Mikhail was next. Where his sister's testimony had been a torrent of emotion, his was a calm, steady presentation of what he believed to be facts. He was the logical one, the son who had inherited my analytical mind, but none of my training with which to interpret the data correctly. He spoke with a sad, reluctant authority, the voice of a man forced to make a rational, if painful, diagnosis. He described my obsessive behaviors, my compulsive need for control. He told the court of my unwavering insistence on sitting in a specific seat in any restaurant, a seat with its back to a solid wall and a clear, unobstructed view of all entrances and exits. He presented this as a bizarre, irrational quirk. I recalled a crowded cafe in Vienna, a sudden commotion, and the glint of a knife that had been meant for me, a glint I had only seen because of my position in the room. What he called an obsession, I called situational awareness. He spoke of my secrecy, my refusal to engage with the modern world. He pointed out my lack of a credit card, my insistence on using cash for most transactions, my complete absence from the vast, interconnected world of social media. He framed it as the paranoia of an old man who feared a world he no longer understood. He could not comprehend that to a man like me, a digital footprint was a liability, a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to a truth that must never be uncovered. My anonymity, my most vital professional tool, was being presented as evidence of my insanity. The final piece of his testimony was an anecdote about a recent family gathering. He recounted how he had asked me a question about my childhood, about the name of the village I had supposedly fled. I had, he told the court, feigned a complete lapse of memory, claiming the details were lost to a distant, painful past. His voice was filled with pity as he described my failing mind. I, on the other hand, remembered the moment with perfect clarity. I had recognized his question for what it was, a casual probe, an attempt to verify a detail of my legend, and I had responded with a classic counter-interrogation technique, feign a cognitive failure to avoid providing a detail that could be checked, a detail that, if found to be inconsistent, could unravel the entire fabric of the cover story. My professional caution was his proof of my mental decay. Throughout their testimony, I kept my face a perfect, placid mask, but inside, I was performing a constant, painful translation. Every symptom of madness they described, I converted back into the cold, hard lexicon of my tradecraft. Paranoia became vigilance, obsession became discipline, emotional distance became control, forgetfulness became security. They were strangers, describing a man they had never known, a fictional character I had invented for their safety and for the success of my long mission. As they spoke, I allowed my gaze to drift to the back of the courtroom, to the anonymous, gray-suited figure of Arthur Jenkins. His face was impassive, but his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, I saw a flicker of profound, professional understanding. He was the only other person in this room who was hearing their testimony and translating it correctly. He knew they were, with heartbreaking sincerity, presenting a perfect psychological profile of a deep-cover operative. The knowledge of his silent comprehension was a small, cold comfort in the devastating warmth of my children's loving, ignorant betrayal. The journey from the courthouse back to my apartment was a retreat into the very fiction that had just been used to condemn me. I walked through the quiet, tree-lined streets of the university district, where I had lived for 30 years, the very picture of the retired professor my neighbors believed me to be. When I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside, the silence that greeted me was absolute. It was the silence of a stage after the actors have gone home, a space filled with the lingering, hollow echo of a performance. For the first time in my long career, I felt the crushing, suffocating weight of the legend I had so meticulously constructed around myself. My apartment was not a home. It was a set piece, a carefully curated museum dedicated to the life of a man who had never existed. I walked through the small, book-lined living room, my hand trailing along the spines of the history tomes that filled the shelves from floor to ceiling. I had read every single one of them. To maintain a cover for 50 years, one must inhabit it, breathe it, know it more intimately than one knows oneself. The histories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Polish Solidarity movement were as much a part of my memory now as my own real, secret past. Behind a row of dense academic texts on the Warsaw Pact, concealed in a hollowed-out space in the wall, were the books that truly belonged to me. Worn, government issue manuals on signal encryption, studies in psychological warfare, and a first edition of the memoirs of a famous KGB defector. My entire life was a library of contradictions, of public fiction and private fact. I stood before the gallery of photographs on the wall above my desk. There I was, a younger version of the professor, standing with my arm around my wife, Anna, in front of some forgettable European landmark on a long-ago sabbatical. There we were with the children, a smiling, happy family on a beach, Mikhail a small boy on my shoulders, Elena holding her mother's hand. The smiles in the photographs were real. The love had been real. But the man in the picture, the gentle, slightly stooped academic with the kind, scholarly eyes, was a ghost. He was a character I had played, a role I had inhabited so completely that even I sometimes forgot where he ended, and I began. Anna had been my partner in this long, quiet play. She had been another operative, assigned to the same deep-cover mission. Her love had been my anchor, the one true, verifiable fact in a sea of official lies. Her death 5 years ago had not just made me a widower. It had made me the sole custodian of our shared secret, a lonely gatekeeper of a truth no one else on earth knew. The full devastating impact of my children's testimony settled upon me, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, creeping chill of a profound and terrible irony. They had stood in a court of law, and, with tears in their eyes, they had described the perfect operative. They had spoken of my paranoia, and I saw the face of the Stasi agent I had narrowly evaded in a Berlin train station. They had spoken of my secrecy, and I remembered the countless nights spent in this very room, decoding messages while they slept peacefully in their beds, blissfully unaware of the silent, invisible war I was fighting to keep their world safe. They had spoken of my emotional distance, and I felt the phantom ache of 1,000 paternal embraces I had suppressed, 1,000 loving words I had swallowed, because emotional attachment, in my line of work, was a vulnerability, a weakness the enemy could exploit. Their betrayal was not an act of malice. It was, in its own tragic way, the ultimate validation of my life's work. I had constructed their reality with such flawless precision that they were willing to sacrifice their own father to a mental institution rather than entertain the slightest possibility that the world they knew was a lie. I had built their cage so perfectly that they could not see the bars. The weight of this realization was a physical thing, a pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. My legend, the shield that had protected me for half a century, had now become the evidence for my own prosecution. I was being condemned by the very success of my own mission. I walked to the window and looked down at the quiet street below as darkness began to fall. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, lonely shadows. I saw my own reflection in the dark glass, the face of a tired, old man. For a moment, I saw the man my children had described, a figure of pity, lost and confused. The despair was a cold, black tide, and I felt myself begin to sink beneath it. It would be so easy to let go, to surrender to their narrative, to accept the quiet, managed oblivion they were offering me. But then, from the deepest, most disciplined core of my being, the operative asserted himself. I had not survived 50 years in the field by surrendering. An agent, when his cover is compromised and he is backed into a corner, does not simply give up. He follows his training. He acts. The cold tide of despair receded, leaving behind the hard, sharp bedrock of resolve. The grief remained, a permanent feature of my internal landscape, but it was no longer a disabling fog. It was a whetstone, sharpening my purpose. I would not be a victim of my own history. I would not allow my life's work to end in this quiet, pathetic tragedy. There were protocols for a situation like this, emergency measures for a compromised asset, buried deep in my memory, but never forgotten. To use them was a grave risk, an admission that the operation had failed. But I was no longer an active asset. I was a man fighting for his name, for his sanity, for his final peaceful place in the country I had served. The decision once made was absolute. I turned from the window. I walked to my bedroom closet and took out an old, unassuming tweed jacket, one I had not worn in at least a decade. My movements were calm, precise. I reached inside the worn lining near the shoulder, and my fingers found the small, hard, flat object that had been sewn there 30 years ago. It was a small, thin disc of non-metallic ceramic, featureless to the touch. It was the first part of a silent, analog signal. I then went to my desk and took out today's newspaper. I looked at the calendar on my wall. My mind, which had been filled with the chaotic ghosts of the past, was now a place of cold, clear, operational planning. The hearing was not the end. It was the beginning of my last mission. The decision, once made in the pre-dawn quiet of my study, set in motion a series of actions governed by a protocol I had not actively considered in over 25 years. It was a sequence of movements and objects buried deep in my memory, a piece of obsolete but still functional code waiting to be executed. My first task was to wait for the correct conditions. The emergency protocol was specific, designed to avoid false positives. The signal could only be initiated on the first clear, sunny Wednesday following the receipt of a direct official threat to my cover. The court summons, now resting in a locked drawer, had been that threat. Today was that Wednesday. My preparations were deliberate and methodical. I dressed not in the comfortable, slightly frayed sweaters of the retired professor, but in a more anonymous uniform: simple gray trousers, a plain white shirt, and a dark, nondescript tweed jacket. The jacket was the key. It was the same one I had retrieved from the back of my closet, and the small, hard ceramic disc sewn into its lining was a cold, reassuring pressure against my shoulder. I then went out and purchased a copy of the day's Washington Post. I did not merely tuck it under my arm. I sat at my kitchen table and folded it with the precision of an origami master. I made a series of specific, seemingly random folds, creasing the paper until the international news section was facing outward, with a particular headline about a trade dispute in Asia prominently displayed. This was the first component of the signal. My journey to the park was not a walk. It was a surveillance detection route. I left my apartment at precisely 9:30 in the morning. I was a ghost, a gray, unremarkable old man. But my mind was a sharp, cold instrument. My senses extended into the urban environment, feeling for any hint of a follower, any discordant note in the city's morning rhythm. I detected nothing. The channel was clear. I arrived at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Park at precisely 10 o'clock. The sun was bright, but offered little warmth against the crisp autumn air. The park was quiet. populated only by a few tourists and a groundskeeper raking leaves into a pile. I walked to my destination, a specific granite bench set back from the main path, directly opposite the polished black wall that bore the names of the dead from the year 1968. The location had been chosen by Jenkins decades ago for its unique strategic properties. It was a place of quiet reflection that discouraged loud conversation. It offered a clear line of sight for 100 yards in every direction, and the constant quiet presence of tourists provided a perfect cover of ambient, transient humanity. I sat down. This was the second component of the signal, the specific location at the specific time. I then executed the third. I placed the carefully folded newspaper on the bench to my right, the headline clearly visible. I then took a book from my coat pocket. It was a slim volume of Robert Frost's poetry, bound in a distinctive, faded blue cloth cover. I opened it and began to read, or rather I pretended to read. My eyes saw the familiar words of "the road not taken," but my mind was far away, my senses fully engaged in the act of waiting. A memory, eidetic and sharp, surfaced. I was a much younger man, sitting in a sterile, featureless room in a CIA safe house in Virginia. Across from me, a younger, darker-haired Arthur Jenkins was drilling me on this very protocol. He had explained the logic, the odds of a random old man sitting on this exact bench at this exact hour, with this exact edition of Frost and this exact, strangely folded newspaper, were infinitesimal. It was a signal that could not be mistaken for a coincidence. For 1 hour, I sat there. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Tourists came and went, their fingers tracing the names etched into the black stone. A child chased a pigeon across the lawn. The world continued its peaceful, ordinary course. But for me, this was the most intense and stressful hour I had endured in years. I was broadcasting a signal into a void, a message to a vast, bureaucratic machine that may have long since forgotten my existence. I was a relic from a forgotten war, a ghost sending a final, desperate transmission. Every person who walked by, every car that slowed on the street beyond the park, was a potential response, or a potential threat. My body was a study in practiced relaxation, but inside, my heart beat a slow, heavy, military cadence. At precisely 11 o'clock, the designated hour was over. The time had come for the final part of the signal. I closed my book and tucked it back into my coat pocket. I stood up, stretched my old, stiff limbs, and then, without a backward glance, I walked away, leaving the folded Washington Post lying on the bench. It was the message in the bottle, the flare sent up from a deserted island. I did not look back to see if anyone retrieved it. The protocol was clear. Leave the signal and clear the area. The walk home was an exercise in pure, nerve-shredding uncertainty. The signal had been sent. The first move of my counter-offensive was complete. Now all I could do was return to my cover, to my role as the confused professor, and wait to see if, after all these years of silence, anyone was still listening. The 3 days that followed the sending of the signal were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I was a man living on 2 separate planes of existence simultaneously. On the surface, I was Professor Novak, the forgetful, gentle academic, a man whose world was shrinking, whose mind was clouding over. I received a visit from Elena, who brought me a container of soup and a heart full of worried pity. I played my part for her with a weary precision, forgetting her husband's name, asking her the same question about her children twice in the space of 10 minutes. I watched the genuine pain in her eyes as she witnessed my performance, and the guilt I felt was a cold, sharp stone in my gut. But beneath this fragile, crumbling facade, the other man, the operative, was on high alert, his senses extended, his mind a cold, analytical engine scanning the world for a response. Every passing car on my street was a potential contact. Every wrong number on my telephone was a possible coded signal. The silence from the vast, invisible machine I had tried to contact was a loud and nerve-shredding roar. The protocol was clear. After the initial signal, I was to return to the same bench in the park at the same hour for the next 3 consecutive days. It was a test of my own discipline and a window for the agency to verify my identity and the security of the location. The first day, I sat for the designated hour, the blue book of poetry in my hands, a solitary, unremarkable figure. The park was nearly empty, the air cold. Nothing happened. I returned home, the knot of uncertainty tightening within me. Had my signal been missed? Was the network truly dormant, a fossil from a bygone era? The second day was a repeat of the first. I sat. I waited. I observed. The tourists came and went. The groundskeeper continued his slow Sisyphean battle with the autumn leaves. The world continued its indifferent course. Still nothing. The weight of my isolation pressed down on me. I was a ghost, haunting the memory of a life of service, a man whose very existence had perhaps been redacted from the official record. On the third day, I returned with a sense of grim, almost hopeless finality. If no contact was made today, the protocol was void. I would be on my own. I sat on the cold granite bench, the wind rustling the pages of my book. I did not pretend to read. I simply watched, my gaze fixed on the middle distance, my mind a blank slate of pure, vigilant awareness. And then, I saw him. He entered the park from the east, walking with the same unhurried, anonymous gait. It was Arthur Jenkins, my old handler, a man who seemed not to have aged, but to have been weathered by time into a more essential version of himself. He wore the same simple gray suit I had seen him in at the courthouse, a uniform of perfect, calculated invisibility. He did not approach me directly. He walked a slow, meandering path around the perimeter of the lawn, a man enjoying a quiet stroll. But I knew what he was doing. He was performing a final, professional counter-surveillance sweep, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, taking in every detail, ensuring the meeting ground was sterile. A memory, sharp and cold, flashed in my mind. Our very first meeting, in a fog-shrouded park in Helsinki. I had been a young, nervous, newly recruited asset. He had been the calm, quiet American who had approached me, his presence exuding a sense of absolute, unnerving competence. He had not been my friend. He had been my commander, the man who held my life in his steady, capable hands. The feeling now was precisely the same. He finally approached the bench and sat down, once again leaving a careful, neutral space between us. He did not look at me. He looked out at the black, polished wall of the memorial, a fellow mourner paying his respects. From the inner pocket of his coat, he withdrew a newspaper. It was the copy of the Washington Post I had left on this very bench 3 days prior, its distinct, deliberate folds still intact. The message was clear. Signal received and understood. He held the paper, pretending to read, for exactly 5 minutes. The silence between us was not empty. It was a professional quiet, charged with the weight of unspoken history and the gravity of the present crisis. He then refolded the newspaper, not in my original coded configuration, but in a simple, neat rectangle. He stood, placed the newspaper on the bench in the space he had just vacated, and then, without a single glance in my direction, he turned and walked away, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. I waited. The protocol demanded a 10-minute delay before retrieving the package. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life. My mind raced with possibilities. Was the newspaper just a confirmation, or did it contain my instructions? Finally, the time elapsed. I calmly closed my book, stood, and picked up the newspaper. It felt heavier than it should. I folded it once more and tucked it under my arm. I walked home, my own path as deliberate and cautious as my journey to the park had been. Back in the locked security of my study, I spread the newspaper out on my desk. There was no obvious note, no hidden message in the headlines. My eyes went to the classified section, the traditional place for this kind of communication. I scanned the columns of text, and then I saw it. A small advertisement for a used car, and within the text of the ad, a series of tiny, almost invisible pinpricks above certain letters. It was an old, simple, and virtually unbreakable code from my training. My hands, steady now, took a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. I began the slow, careful work of transcribing the marked letters. 10 minutes later, I had the message. It was not a long one. It was a time, a date, and the address of a law firm in the city. The final line was a single coded phrase that meant, "You are not alone. Full support authorized." A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The network was alive. My ally had been reactivated. I was no longer a ghost. I was an asset, and the agency was coming to bring me in from the cold. The address on the coded message led me to a quiet, tree-lined street in the city's old legal district. The law firm of Fielding & Associates was housed in a modest, unassuming brownstone, its brass plaque polished but discreet. There was nothing about the building to attract attention. It was a perfect piece of urban camouflage, an anonymous facade that projected an aura of quiet, old-world respectability. This was a classic agency safe house, a secure and sterile environment for the most sensitive of meetings. A quiet, elderly secretary in the lobby greeted me with a polite, vacant smile, and without my having to state my name, she simply nodded and gestured toward a heavy, soundproofed door at the end of the hall. She was a gatekeeper, another quiet veteran of the long, secret war. The room I entered was a conference room, but it felt more like a vault. The walls were paneled in a dark, heavy wood, the air was still and cool, and there were no windows. The only furniture was a long, heavy mahogany table and a set of high-backed leather chairs. Arthur Jenkins was already there, seated at the far end of the table, his back to the wall. He was not looking at the door. He was studying a thick file that lay open before him, a file that I knew, with absolute certainty, was my own. He looked up only when the door had clicked shut behind me, his gaze sharp and analytical, the look of a case officer assessing the current state of his asset. I felt a strange and familiar sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in 5 years, since Anna's death, I was in a room with someone who knew the truth. I took the seat opposite him. The polished surface of the table between us was a vast, empty space, a neutral ground upon which the details of my compromised mission would be laid bare. I opened the briefcase I had carried and began my debriefing. It was a silent, formal process, governed by the unwritten rules of our old profession. I placed a single, neatly organized file folder in the center of the table. It was not a thick file. It contained only the essential intelligence, a copy of the official court summons for the competency hearing, and a verbatim transcript I had typed from memory of my children's testimony, their words a cold, black litany of my supposed failings. This was the threat assessment, the summary of the enemy's capabilities and line of attack. Jenkins slid the folder across the table toward him. He put on a pair of simple, steel-rimmed reading glasses and began to read. His face, a landscape of carefully controlled neutrality, betrayed nothing. But I, who had been trained to read him as closely as I would a coded telex, saw the subtle tells. I saw the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around his jaw as he read Elena's tearful account of my paranoia. I saw his thumb press down hard on the corner of the page as he reviewed Mikhail's factual evidence of my fiscal incompetence. He was not reacting with personal sympathy. He was reacting with the cold anger of a senior officer whose 50-year operation was being threatened by the emotional, unpredictable actions of untrained civilians. As he read, My mind was pulled back through time. The sterile, quiet room around me dissolved, replaced by the memory of another debriefing in another, more dangerous city. I was in a dimly lit, smoke-filled apartment in West Berlin, the sound of the S-Bahn rattling the windows. I was a young man then, my nerves still frayed from a risky cross-border operation. Jenkins, looking much the same as he did now, sat across from me at a rickety table, his face illuminated by a single bare bulb as he calmly absorbed the details of my report. The feeling of that moment was precisely the same as the one I felt now. The profound, absolute relief of handing over the weight of a mission to a superior officer, the trust in a system that was larger and more powerful than myself. Jenkins finished reading. He closed the folder and pushed it back to the center of the table. He then took out a small plain notepad and a pen. The silent written portion of the debriefing began. He wrote a single concise question and pushed the notepad across to me. Children's motivation? I took the pen. My own written response was equally brief, a stripped-down intelligence summary. Genuine concern, based on ignorance of legend. No malice detected. They are unwitting antagonists. He read my reply and gave a single slow nod. He understood the tragic, complicated core of the problem. His next question: immediate risk level to cover. My reply: critical. Hearing is the kill box. Legend will not survive judicial scrutiny of my background. He absorbed this, his expression grim. He then began to write again, not a question, but a series of statements, the first outlines of a countermove. Legal intervention required. Highest level. State Department channel, not agency. He was already building a firewall, planning a response that would protect me without ever acknowledging the true source of the protection. He looked up at me, his gaze direct and steady. It was the look of a commander giving a critical order. He wrote a final line on the notepad. Maintain cover. Do not deviate. Await contact. I met his gaze and gave a single nod of my own. Message received and understood. My orders were clear. The meeting was over. He stood, took the file I had brought, and placed it in his own briefcase. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and gave me one last look, a fleeting, almost human expression of solidarity. Then he was gone. I remained in the silent, windowless room for a few more minutes, the weight of a lifetime of secrecy pressing down on me. But now, it was a shared weight. I was no longer a retired, forgotten asset. I was a soldier, back on active duty, my commanding officer once again at the helm. My orders were simple and absolute: maintain cover and await contact. The days that followed my debriefing with Jenkins stretched into a week, then two, a period of profound and nerve-wracking stillness. I was a submarine, running on silent, deep beneath the surface of my own life, waiting for the signal to surface. My existence became a study in disciplined performance. I continued to inhabit the role of the declining professor with a new and focused intensity. I endured the visits from my children, their faces a mixture of pity and a growing, frustrated impatience. I played my part, feigning confusion over the remote control, misplacing my glasses, allowing my sentences to drift off into a vague, empty space. Each of these small, humiliating acts was now a part of the mission, a piece of the camouflage required to keep the target unsuspecting, while the real war was being fought on a distant, invisible front. During the long, quiet hours alone in my apartment, my mind, unable to rest, would travel to the place where my fate was being decided. I would sit in my armchair and, with the practiced imagination of an intelligence analyst, I would visualize the bureaucratic war being waged on my behalf. I saw my own name, my operational call sign from a forgotten era, Cassiopeia, materializing as a blinking light on a computer screen in a secure subterranean archive in Langley. I pictured a young anonymous archivist being dispatched into the cold, climate-controlled stacks to retrieve my file. A thick, heavy document bound in red tape, a file that had likely not seen the light of day in a quarter of a century. I could almost smell the dry, dusty scent of old secrets as its pages were opened. I imagined the file landing on a desk in a modern, glass-walled office, a stark contrast to the dark, smoky rooms where my missions had once been planned. I saw Jenkins, my quiet, gray-suited handler, presenting my case to a new generation of agency leadership. The faces I pictured around the conference table were not the hard, weathered faces of the cold warriors I had known. They were younger, sharper, with degrees from Ivy League business schools, men and women who spoke the language of risk assessment and liability mitigation, not of tradecraft and loyalty. To them, I was not a man. I was a legacy asset, a complicated and potentially embarrassing loose end from a previous, less structured era. I could envision the arguments, the slow, careful dance of bureaucracy. I could hear the dispassionate voices of the agency's lawyers discussing the legal precedents, the potential for public exposure, the political ramifications of intervening in a domestic civil matter. My life, my identity, my very sanity, had been reduced to a line item in a risk analysis report. The irony was as cold and as sharp as a shard of ice. I had spent my life as a ghost, a non-person, existing only in the shadows. And now, my only hope for a peaceful public existence as a citizen depended on the actions of other ghosts in other, more powerful shadows. As I pictured this slow, grinding battle of memos and secure video conferences, a memory surfaced. I was a young field agent, stranded in a cold water flat in a hostile Eastern European city after a mission had gone disastrously wrong. I had been ordered to remain in place and await instructions. For 6 days, I had waited in a silence as profound as the one I was living now, subsisting on stale bread and the constant gnawing fear of a boot kicking in the door. I had no idea if my signal for extraction had been received, no idea if I had been abandoned. Then, on the 7th day, the signal had come. The system, slow and ponderous as it was, had worked. That memory was a small, hard anchor in the storm of my current uncertainty. I had trusted the system then. I had to trust it now. The first tangible sign that the invisible war was turning in my favor arrived in the mail, nearly 3 weeks after my meeting with Jenkins. It was a simple, official-looking envelope from the county court. My hands were steady as I opened it. It was a formal notice, a single sheet of paper informing me that the competency hearing, scheduled for the following week, had been postponed indefinitely at the request of the Department of Homeland Security's legal counsel, citing the need to review newly discovered information pertaining to the petitioner's immigration history. The government lawyer, the earnest young man who was supposed to be a neutral party, had just become my unwitting pawn. Jenkins was not just fighting a battle within the agency. He was already manipulating the external, legal battlefield, using the immense, invisible weight of the federal government to stall the proceedings and buy us more time. I read the notice 3 times. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic maneuvering. It revealed nothing, yet it changed everything. It was a quiet, paper-thin signal that the vast, powerful machinery of my former employers was now grinding into motion on my behalf. My children would receive the same notice. I could imagine their confusion, their frustration. This was an unforeseen complication, a random, inexplicable delay in their carefully laid plans. They would see it as a piece of bad luck, a frustrating but temporary setback. They could never conceive of the truth, that it was a deliberate, strategic move, the first artillery shell from an unseen army, landing squarely in the middle of their campaign. I folded the notice and placed it on my desk. I was still a prisoner of my own legend, still the confused old man in the eyes of my family. But I was no longer a man adrift. I had a powerful, invisible ally, and the bureaucratic war, I now knew, was a war we were going to win. The notice of the court's delay was a temporary reprieve, a tactical pause in a war that was far from over. It was a signal from Jenkins that the bureaucratic gears were turning, but the machine of the state grinds slowly, and my children's own legal machine, though stalled, was still a potent threat. The weeks that followed the notice were a strange and quiet purgatory. I continued to live inside my legend, a careful and exhausting performance, while simultaneously waiting for the final directive from an invisible command structure. The strain of this dual existence was immense. I was a man on a wire, balancing between the feigned world of my senility and the secret, tense world of my silent, ongoing operation. The summons for the final briefing arrived, as before, through a subtle analog channel. A new book had been placed on the recent returns shelf at my local library, a thick history of the Venetian Republic. Tucked inside, I found a single streetcar ticket, its reverse side bearing a handwritten date and time. The location was once again the discreet law firm of Fielding and Associates. This was it. This was the meeting where the results of Jenkins's invisible bureaucratic war would be delivered to me. The waiting was over. The time for the final strategic directive had come. I made the journey to the brownstone office with the solemn gravity of a soldier being summoned to headquarters before a major offensive. I performed my surveillance detection route out of pure ingrained habit, but my mind was elsewhere. It was focused on the possible outcomes, the strategic options that might be presented to me. When the quiet, elderly secretary showed me into the same windowless, wood-paneled conference room, the scene was one of sober finality. Jenkins was there, seated in the same chair as before, a silent gray eminence. Mr. Fielding, the lawyer, a man who existed as a living firewall between my world and the agency's, sat at the head of the table. They did not greet me. They simply watched as I took my seat. The air in the room was thick with a profound, unspoken seriousness. In the center of the polished mahogany table lay a single object, a large, heavy envelope made of creamy, watermarked paper. It was sealed on the back with a deep blue, wax-like emblem that I immediately recognized. It was not the eagle of the CIA, but the Great Seal of the United States Department of State. It was a symbol of immense, overt, and official power. Mr. Fielding, with a quiet, deliberate gesture, pushed the envelope across the table toward me. My fingers, as I picked it up, registered its weight and the quality of the paper. This was not a document generated in a field office. This was a product of the highest echelons of power. I looked at Jenkins. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Open it." I slid my finger under the flap. The seal was ceremonial. The envelope was not glued shut. Inside, there was a single sheet of the same heavy official stationery. At the top, in elegant engraved script, were the words, "The Secretary of State, Washington." I began to read. The document was a masterpiece of the specific, calculated ambiguity that is the native tongue of both spies and diplomats. It was a letter, addressed formally to the presiding judge, the Honorable Maria Ramirez. Its language was a careful, deliberate dance around the truth, a text designed to reveal everything by confirming nothing. It began by acknowledging the court's ongoing inquiry into the citizenship and competency of one Mr. Alexander Novak. It then stated, in a cool, declarative tone, that the United States government wished to submit a statement for the court's private, in-camera review. The letter went on to state that my initial asylum and subsequent immigration status had been processed and managed through sensitive channels for reasons of national security. I read that phrase again. It was the first key. It was a bureaucratic kill shot, a phrase that immediately elevated my case from a simple civil matter to something that touched the third rail of American law. The next paragraph was even more potent. It stated that I had, over a period of several decades, provided quiet but significant and invaluable service to the strategic interests of the United States in a highly sensitive capacity. It did not say how. It did not say where. It did not mention the agency by name. It simply placed my entire fictional life under the vast, unassailable blanket of national security. The final paragraph was the master stroke. It respectfully requested that the court accept this official attestation and, in the interest of protecting ongoing national security concerns, seal all records pertaining to the case. The letter was signed, not by a low-level functionary, but by the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, a name I recognized, a man of immense public stature and unimpeachable authority. I placed the letter down on the table. This was the turning point. This was the weapon Jenkins had forged for me in the quiet, unseen fires of the bureaucratic war. It did not refute my children's testimony. It rendered it utterly irrelevant. Their sincere, loving, and devastating account of my madness was now nothing more than the tragic misunderstanding of civilians who had stumbled into the periphery of a world they could never comprehend. The letter explained everything about me, by explaining nothing at all. As I looked at the powerful official document, I felt a deep and profound sense of irony. My life in the shadows had been spent creating forgeries, falsehoods, and pieces of elegant disinformation to deceive our enemies. And now, my life in the light was being saved by a single, perfect piece of absolute, if heavily veiled, truth. Mr. Fielding slid a fresh, identical envelope across the table, along with a stick of what looked like red wax. He took the letter, folded it with care, and slid it into the new envelope. He then lit the wax with a lighter and let a small pool of it drip onto the flap before pressing the State Department seal into it. He had created a perfect official duplicate, a weapon ready to be deployed. Jenkins then pushed his notepad toward me. On it, he had written the final order, "Your final word. Present this, nothing more." The strategy was as simple as it was devastating. I was to remain in character, a confused old man, until the very last moment. And then I would present this single, silent, and absolute refutation. I took the sealed envelope. Its weight in my hand was the weight of my future, of my freedom. I placed it in my briefcase, stood, nodded to both men, and walked out of the room. The turning point had been crossed. The endgame was now in sight. I returned to my apartment, the sealed cream-colored envelope a heavy, solid presence in my briefcase. It felt different from any object I had ever carried. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, not a tool of deception, or a piece of stolen intelligence. It was, in its own strange, bureaucratic way, the truth. Or at least, the most truth I was ever going to be allowed to possess in the open world. I did not place it in my safe. Its power did not lie in its secrecy, but in its official, undeniable authenticity. I laid it in the top drawer of my desk, among the simple, mundane items of my life: my pens, my checkbook, my reading glasses. It rested there, a sleeping lion, a quiet, formidable power waiting to be unleashed. The rescheduled court date was a week away. This period of waiting was different from the tense, uncertain vigil I had kept before. The question was no longer if I would survive, but how the final act would play out. My days were now spent in contemplation of the document I had been given. I did not need to reread it. Every carefully chosen, deliberately ambiguous word was permanently etched into my memory. Sensitive channels. Reasons of national security. Quiet, but significant and invaluable service. It was a new legend, a final cover story designed not to conceal my life, but to explain it in a way the public world could accept. I was no longer to be the simple refugee professor. I was now to become the quiet patriot, the unsung hero, A man whose eccentricities and paranoia were not symptoms of decay, but the honorable scars of a long and secret war. This new identity was a strange and uncomfortable garment to consider. For 50 years, my existence had been a clean, sharp binary. There was the public fiction of Professor Novak, a life of tweed jackets, dusty books, and quiet academic debates. And there was the private reality of Cassiopeia, the deep-cover operative, a life of cold fear, brutal discipline, and absolute solitude. I had learned to move between these two realities, to keep the firewall between them perfect and absolute. But this letter created a third entity, a strange hybrid of the two. It was a public acknowledgement of my secret life, a version of the truth sanitized for public consumption. It was a legend built upon a foundation of fact, and in many ways that made it the most complex and difficult identity I had ever been asked to assume. I would sit for hours in my study, the props of my old legend all around me, and I would try to reconcile these three versions of myself. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window and saw the face of the man my children believed to be losing his mind. But I also saw the face of the young man who had once slipped across a fortified border in the dead of night. And now, I had to see a third face, the one the State Department had created for me, the face of a quiet servant of the state. I felt like an actor being handed a new and final script, one that rewrote the ending of a long and difficult play. A memory, distant and faded, but still sharp, came to me. I was 25 years old, in a featureless, windowless room in a government building outside Washington. A man, not Jenkins, but one of his predecessors, a man with cold, clear eyes, was explaining the terms of my life's mission. He had told me that my old identity, my real name, my real history, would be surgically removed, erased from every record. I would cease to exist. In exchange, I would be given a new life, a new legend, and the unwavering, if invisible, support of the United States government. I remembered his final words, spoken in a flat, unemotional tone. "You will be a ghost, Mr. Novak, but you will be our ghost, and we do not abandon our own." For 50 years, I had wondered if that promise was as much a fiction as the identity they had given me. The heavy envelope resting in my desk drawer was the answer. The promise, made in a cold room half a century ago, was being kept. With this new official truth came the final, painful acceptance of the chasm between myself and my children. I took out the old family photo albums again. I looked at the images of Elena and Mikhail as small, laughing children, their faces full of a simple, uncomplicated love for the man they believed was their father. They had built their entire lives, their entire understanding of the world, upon the foundation of the legend I had so carefully maintained. This letter, my salvation, would be the final, irrevocable act that would make me a permanent stranger to them. It would not give them the real truth, the story of the Cold War operative. It would only replace one mystery with another, greater one. Their father was not a madman, the court would say, but his life was a state secret. They would be left in a permanent, unbridgeable state of ignorance, with a father they could never truly know. Their loving betrayal answered not with explanation, but with a wall of official, classified silence. This was the ultimate price of my freedom. In choosing to save myself, in choosing to accept the aid of the country I had served, I was choosing to lose my children forever. I looked at their smiling, innocent faces in the old photographs, and I felt the cold, quiet grief of a father mourning the living. On the last night before the final hearing, I stood before the mirror. I saw the old man, the professor, the spy, and I saw the new man, the quiet patriot. I took the sealed, cream-colored envelope from my desk and placed it in the inside pocket of the suit I would wear to court. It lay against my chest, a heavy, final truth. The bureaucratic war had been won. The weight of my old legend was about to be lifted. I was ready to claim my new one. I was ready for the end. The final 24 hours were a period of profound and penetrating calm. The frantic energy of the initial threat, the tense, covert dance of re-establishing contact, the intellectual rigor of the bureaucratic war, all that was over. The strategy was set. The weapon was in my possession. All that remained was the final, formal presentation, the last act of a play that had been 50 years in the making. My apartment, which had been a stage, a safe house, and a command center, was now simply a quiet place to wait for the dawn. There was a unique and familiar stillness to this time, the quiet, focused hush that settles over a command post in the final hours before a major operation begins. My preparations for the morning were the methodical grounding rituals of a soldier. I did not pace. I did not wring my hands. I imposed order. I went to my closet and took out the suit I had chosen for the occasion. It was not my usual professor's tweed, but a simple dark gray suit of a conservative cut, the kind of anonymous uniform worn by bureaucrats and functionaries the world over. It was the clothing of a man who wishes to be taken seriously, but not to be noticed. I laid it out carefully on my bed. I selected a plain white shirt and a simple dark blue tie. I then spent a full half-hour polishing my best leather shoes, the repetitive, circular motion of the brush a kind of meditation, the acrid scent of the polish a familiar, comforting smell. It was the work of a man preparing his uniform for a final, formal inspection. With my attire prepared, I went to my desk. I opened my briefcase and began to pack it. I first placed the thick file of my original immigration papers inside, the masterfully crafted work of fiction that had been my life's primary text. The asylum application, the letters of recommendation from fictional colleagues, the academic credentials from a university that no longer existed. It was the complete and total architecture of a lie. Then, beside it, I placed the single-sealed, cream-colored envelope from the State Department. The old legend and the new veiled truth lying side by side. The juxtaposition was a perfect, silent summary of my entire existence. Seeing them together, I felt not conflict, but a sense of a circle finally closing. I spent some time in my study, the room that had served as the primary set for the character of Professor Novak. I did not read. I simply stood in the center of the room, observing the props of a lifetime. I ran my hand over the leather-bound spines of the history books, acknowledging their long, faithful service as pillars of my cover. I looked at the maps of Cold War-era Europe on the wall, the faded colors and shifting borders a testament to a world that, like my own secret life, had vanished into history. For 50 years, I had lived in this room, thought in this room, and maintained the constant, low-level vigilance of my role. It was a performance that had been so long and so total that it had become a part of my own reality. I felt a quiet, final sense of farewell to the man I had pretended to be. He had served his purpose. He had kept me safe. He had allowed me to raise a family. Tomorrow, he would be honorably discharged. My thoughts inevitably turned to the unwitting casualties of this long war, my children. I took the old family photo album from the bottom shelf and sat down in my armchair. I did not look through all of it. I opened it to a single photograph near the end. It was the last picture ever taken of the four of us together, at a small party for my 75th birthday. Anna was still alive then, frail, but her smile was as radiant as ever. She stood beside me, her hand on my arm. Elena and Mikhail stood on either side of us, their own smiles wide and genuine. We looked, in that captured moment, like a perfectly happy, normal family. The image was a beautiful lie, not because the love was not real, but because the central figure, The patriarch was a complete fabrication. They were smiling at a man they did not know. My victory tomorrow, my hard-won freedom, would be their final, permanent dispossession. The letter in my briefcase would save me, but it would also lock them out forever, leaving them with a father who was not a madman, but who was a permanent and officially sanctioned mystery, a man whose life was a state secret. The quiet grief of this realization was the final, heavy price of my survival. I closed the album and placed it back on the shelf. I looked at the photograph of Anna on my desk. I remembered a night, long ago, in a bare, cold apartment in a city whose name I can no longer recall. We had just received our final briefing before being deployed to America. We had been given our new names, our new histories, the foundational documents of the legend we were to inhabit. I remembered the fear in her eyes and the equal measure of resolve. I remembered the silent promise that had passed between us that night, a promise to see the mission through, to protect each other, to serve the cause we had both chosen, no matter the cost. My actions tomorrow would be the final fulfillment of that promise. It was a matter of honor, a final duty to her, to the service, and to the man I had been. I sat in the darkness, the house a silent, waiting vessel. The turmoil was gone. The doubt was gone. The emotional calculus was complete. All that remained was a profound and unshakable calm, the quiet certainty of an operative whose mission is clear, whose preparations are complete, and who is ready to face the dawn. The second time I entered the hearing room, the beige walls seemed to have absorbed the weeks of anxious waiting, and the air was thick with a sense of grim finality. I took my place beside Mr. Fielding, my posture once again assuming the slight, weary stoop of the character I had inhabited for half a century. Across the aisle, I saw my children. The unexplained delay in the proceedings had changed them. Their initial confident sorrow had been replaced by a nervous, frayed apprehension. They looked at me, their faces a mixture of pity and a new, uncertain frustration, as if I were a stubborn, illogical problem they could not solve. They were correct. I was a problem whose parameters they could never hope to understand. I settled into my chair, my briefcase resting on the floor beside my feet, and I became, for one last time, the quiet, confused Professor Novak. Their lawyer began his final summation. He was a man whose frustration was palpable. He spoke of the mysterious, unprecedented delay, hinting that it was yet another sign of the powerful, shadowy forces that were manipulating a vulnerable old man. He painted a picture of my life as a series of sad, incomprehensible events, a narrative that could only be explained by the tragic onset of senility. He rehashed my children's testimony, his voice resonating with a deep, theatrical sincerity. He spoke of my paranoia, my confusion, my emotional distance. He implored the judge to look past the bureaucratic delays and see the simple human tragedy before her, a loving family fighting to protect their patriarch from the twilight of his own mind. He was a good lawyer, his arguments passionate, his logic based on the false premise of my life, almost convincing. As he spoke, I looked not at him, but at my children. I saw Elena crying silently into a handkerchief. I saw Mikhail staring at his hands, his jaw clenched in a rictus of painful resolve. They believed every word. Their sincerity was the sharpest and most painful knife in the room. When he finished, a heavy silence fell. The case against me, against the fictional Professor Novak, was complete. All that was left was the verdict. The judge, her face a mask of judicial impartiality, looked at my lawyer. Mr. Fielding, who had remained silent and impassive throughout the entire proceeding, slowly rose to his feet. He was not a dramatic man. His presence was one of quiet, unimpeachable gravity. He did not address the opposing counsel's arguments. He did not call me to the stand. He simply looked at the judge, and in a quiet, formal tone, he informed her that the respondent had a final, personal statement to submit to the court for her consideration. Then he turned his head and looked at me. It was not a command. It was a simple, permissive nod. The stage was now mine. I pushed my chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor shockingly loud in the silent room. I rose to my feet. I did not stoop. I stood to my full height, the ingrained posture of a military man, a posture I had not allowed myself in this room before. A flicker of surprise, of pure, unadulterated confusion, crossed my children's faces. This was not the broken, shuffling old man they had described. This was someone else. I did not look at them. I looked at the American flag, and then I began to walk. My steps were slow, deliberate, each footfall on the worn government-issue carpet a quiet, firm statement. It was a long walk, across the open space in the center of the room, a no-man's land between the two warring sides of my own history. I reached the foot of the judge's dais. I paused, and then I placed my old, worn leather briefcase on the clerk's table. I opened the latches, the metallic clicks loud and sharp. First, I took out the thick-bound file of my original asylum and immigration papers, the masterwork of fiction that had been my life's operating text. I placed it gently on the table. Then I reached back into the briefcase and retrieved the second item, the heavy cream-colored envelope, its back sealed with the dark blue wax of the Department of State. I placed it directly on top of the first file, the old legend, now covered and superseded by the new, veiled truth. The action was a silent, symbolic summary of my entire existence. I looked up and met Judge Ramirez's eyes. I held her gaze for a single profound moment. My face was a blank slate, devoid of pleading, of anger, of any emotion whatsoever. I was a messenger, delivering a dispatch of the highest possible priority. I gave a single, slow, formal nod, an acknowledgement of her authority and the gravity of the moment. Then I turned, with the same deliberate, unhurried pace, and walked back to my chair. I sat down, my back once again perfectly straight. My hands I placed on the table before me, one over the other. My final word had been spoken. It was an act of submission, not to my children's narrative, but to a higher, more absolute truth, a truth that was now resting, sealed and silent, in the hands of the court. The room was a vacuum of stunned, breathless silence. Judge Ramirez looked down at the envelope, her expression a mixture of profound bewilderment and dawning, momentous understanding. The battle was over. All that remained was the reading of the terms of surrender. The silence that followed my return to my seat was not an empty one. It was a dense, charged vacuum, a moment of profound and universal suspension in which the entire trajectory of my life and the lives of my children hung in a delicate and precarious balance. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge's bench, on the two files I had placed there, the thick, worn record of my 50-year lie and the slim, pristine envelope that contained its final, veiled truth. I watched Judge Ramirez. I was no longer an actor in this drama. I was an observer, a cryptographer watching a recipient decode a final, critical message. For a long moment, she did not touch it. She simply looked down at the State Department seal on the envelope, her expression a mixture of judicial annoyance and a dawning, reluctant curiosity. I could see the internal calculations in her sharp, intelligent eyes. This was an unprecedented and irregular move, a breach of all normal protocol. But the seal was undeniable, a symbol of an authority that, in the quiet, orderly world of her courtroom, was a foreign and superior power. With a final, decisive movement, she picked up a long, slender letter opener from her desk. The blade slid under the heavy wax seal, which broke with a soft, clean snap. The sound, in the dead silence of the room, was as loud and as final as a closing door. She carefully withdrew the single heavy sheet of paper and unfolded it. As she began to read, her face, which had been a mask of professional impartiality, became a transparent text that I, a lifelong student of human signals, could read with perfect clarity. The first stage was subtle, a slight furrowing of her brow, a tightening of her lips. She was absorbing the initial formal language, the bureaucratic pleasantries. Then her posture shifted. She sat up straighter, her back becoming a rigid, straight line. Her eyes, which had been scanning the page, now slowed, her focus intensifying, absorbing each word with a new and profound seriousness. She had reached the phrase, "reasons of national security." The atmosphere in the room, already tense, seemed to grow colder, thinner. I risked a glance at my children. They were watching the judge with a look of utter, uncomprehending bewilderment. Their lawyer was leaning forward, his face a mask of anxious confusion, trying to decipher the meaning of the judge's reaction. They had expected a rambling handwritten letter from a confused old man. They were now watching a senior federal judge react to a document with the gravity of a person who has just been handed a state secret. Their own narrative, the simple tragic story of a failing father, was beginning to dissolve in the face of a power they could not see and did not understand. The judge continued to read. I saw the moment she reached the passage about my quiet but significant and invaluable service. Her head, which had been bent over the page, came up sharply. Her eyes, wide with a sudden dawning shock, left the letter and flew across the room to me. And in that look, everything changed. She was no longer looking at a pitiable old man, a potential ward of the state. She was looking at someone else entirely. She was looking at a ghost, a man whose entire, quiet, academic life had been a lie of a magnitude that her orderly, legalistic world could barely contain. Her gaze held a mixture of awe, of respect, and of a profound, almost fearful, understanding. I held her gaze, my own face a perfect, placid blank. She finished the letter. Her hands, when she placed it back down on her desk, were perfectly steady, but I could see the slight flush of color high on her cheekbones. The transformation was complete. She was no longer just a judge in a civil hearing. She was a guardian of a state secret, a newly deputized officer in a silent, invisible war. She looked at my children, and the look in her eyes was one of pure, glacial ice. The sympathy was gone. The pity was gone. All that remained was the cold, dismissive contempt for two civilians who, in their ignorance and their arrogance, had blundered into the delicate, dangerous machinery of national security. Her actions from that point were swift, precise, and absolute. She took the letter, folded it, and slid it back into its official envelope. She then took that envelope and the thick file of my old legend and placed them together in a large, new, unmarked folder. With a heavy, deliberate motion, she took a large rubber stamp and brought it down on the cover of the new folder, the impact a sharp, percussive thud. The word, in stark red letters, was sealed. She then picked up her gavel. The sharp, definitive crack of wood on wood echoed through the room. She announced, her voice cold and devoid of all its previous warmth, that the petition for conservatorship was dismissed with prejudice. She then announced that my application for United States citizenship was granted, effective immediately. Her final act was to declare the entire record of the case, from that moment forward, sealed by judicial order, citing the authority of federal statutes I knew to be related to state secrets. She rose, a black-robed figure of absolute final authority, and swept from the room without a backward glance at my children. The aftermath was a scene of silent, utter devastation. My children and their lawyer were frozen in their chairs, a tableau of incomprehensible defeat. They had not just lost their case, their entire reality had been summarily executed in front of them by a power they could not name, and for a reason they would never know. I stood, my movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Fielding gave me a quiet, affirming nod. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them behind in the wreckage of the world I had so carefully built for them, a world that had just been declared a national secret. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding, indifferent light of a new day. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, the sound a dull, final thud, a punctuation mark at the end of a very long and complicated sentence. I stood on the top step, and for the first time in 50 years, I felt the simple, profound sensation of existing without a cover story. The man who had entered the courthouse that morning was a legal fiction, a carefully constructed character named Professor Novak, a man whose very existence was under threat. The man who walked out now was Alexander Novak, a citizen of the United States of America, a man whose true, if veiled, identity had just been affirmed by the full weight and authority of the state. The air felt different. The light seemed sharper. The distant sounds of the city, the horns and the sirens, seemed less like a threat and more like the ambient, living pulse of the country I could now officially call my own. Across the wide, busy street, I saw him. Arthur Jenkins was leaning against the stone wall of an old bank building, a gray, anonymous figure nearly lost in the river of pedestrians. He was not looking at me, but I knew he was watching. Our final debriefing was not to be held in a secure room or a safe house. It was to be held here, in the open, in plain sight. I descended the marble steps and waited for the light to change, a new citizen patiently obeying the simple civic rules of his new home. When the signal flashed, I crossed the street. I did not walk toward him. I simply began to walk down the crowded sidewalk, and after a few paces I sensed, more than saw, him fall into step beside me. We walked together for 3 city blocks. We did not speak. We did not look at each other. We were 2 old men, walking in perfect, synchronized step, our shoulders occasionally brushing. It was a silent, moving debriefing, a final patrol for 2 old soldiers. The city swirled around us, a chaos of noise and motion, but in the small private space between us, there was a profound and absolute silence. The shared quiet of 2 men who had built a life's work on the value of unspoken things. As we neared a bustling intersection, he subtly shifted closer. His hand, holding a folded newspaper, brushed against mine. I felt him press a small, hard, rectangular object into my palm. My own hand closed around it instinctively. It was a passport, my new official passport, the final piece of my new identity. We reached the corner and stopped, waiting for the light. This was the designated end of our journey. He turned his head and looked at me, his face, for the first time, stripped of its professional impassivity. In his eyes, I saw not the cool assessment of a handler, but the quiet, profound respect of a fellow veteran. He had kept the promise made in a cold room half a century ago. He had brought his agent in from the cold. He gave a single final nod, a gesture of farewell, of mission accomplished, of a lifetime of shared secrets being sealed away forever. I nodded in return. Then he turned and was simply gone, absorbed back into the anonymous, flowing crowd, a ghost returning to the shadows, leaving me alone in the light. I walked the rest of the way home, the small, hard rectangle of the passport a warm, solid presence in my coat pocket. My apartment, when I arrived, felt different. It was no longer a stage set, no longer a cage of a carefully constructed lie. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the wall, the worn armchair by the window. They were no longer props. They were my things. This was my home. I closed the door behind me, and the silence that filled the space was not one of loneliness or tension, but of a deep and settled peace. I went to my desk. I took out the new passport. I opened it. There was my own face, older, lined with the history of 1,000 secrets, looking back at me. And there was my name, my real name, Alexander Novak, printed in the clean, official font of the United States government. I thought then of my children. I felt a wave of profound, heartbreaking sadness, but it was a clean grief, a scar that no longer ached. They were lost to me, casualties of a war they had never known existed. They would live out their lives in the shadow of a mystery they could never solve, believing their father to be a strange, sad man protected by inexplicable forces. I had given them a life of safety and privilege, but I could never give them the one thing that might have saved us: the truth. I accepted this as the final, unchangeable price of my long service. I took the new passport, and I slid it into the top drawer of my desk. I placed it beside the old, silver-framed photograph of my Anna, the one true partner in my long, secret life. My real name and her real face finally resting together in a place of peace. I was a citizen. I was a widower. I was a father to children I would never speak to again. I was a quiet patriot whose final service had been to the preservation of his own quiet, solitary, and hard-won peace. I sat in my armchair as evening fell, and I watched the lights of the city begin to glow in the twilight, a constellation of a million other lives, and for the first time, I felt like one of them.